welcome to Pivo Brewery and Blepta Studios. I'm so glad you're here for the virtual tour. So some of the things I do here in the studio include decorative eggs, and so I really enjoy working on those. Everything from ostrich like that to emu and rhea, all the way down to tiny little quail eggs. And another thing that I've been doing when we can all get together in a group, we enjoy having classes where people will come and paint with me. And sometimes they'll paint with brushes, like for example one of these. And sometimes they'll paint using paint pouring like this. And here are some examples. These are coasters that I made out of paint pours on tiles. So that's what we'll demonstrate today. So now we're all set up to do a paint pour demonstration. The paint that I like to use is just acrylic paint. Sometimes I use art quality acrylic paint, sometimes I use house paint. As long as it's an acrylic paint, it works fine. And then I mix it with a paint conditioner. The kind I like to use is Flood Floetrol. And what that does to the paint is it makes each color want to stay together with itself and away from the others. So it kind of makes bubbling and marbling kinds of things. It also makes it flow really, like it waters it down in a way, and it makes it take forever to dry, like 2 weeks to dry or something like that. So you do have to plan ahead for that if that's a concern of yours. It's going to be where it is and wet for a while. Anyway, I'll show you how to do it. So I keep my paints all mixed up in squeeze bottles, but that's not necessary. You can mix them up each time. These are glazed ceramic tiles that you just get at the hardware store. I use them because they're inexpensive and sturdy, but you could use lots of different things. A lot of times I'll pour on canvas. I also pour on LP records. Don't worry, I don't use any that are nice to listen to. They're all scratched and unusable, or things that people don't want to listen to anymore. I love to get them at the Depot outlet. That's my favorite place to get them, but I also have them gifted to me by people. So what I'm doing now is called a puddle pour. So I'm just dripping the paint directly onto the surface. And then once there's enough paint on there, I'm going to use my torch to pop any bubbles. And then I'm going to tilt it around so that the whole surface is covered and there's not too much paint. If you would leave too much paint on there, it would crack once it dried. And so I think one of the things that my clients or customers or students, whatever you'd like to call them, find so attractive about this type of art is it's very freeing. You have some control over the outcome. You have definitely decisions you can make that change it, but to a certain point you just have to let it be what it is. And so if you're nervous about how well you can do art or something, it can be really a nice thing to try. People really enjoy it. They have a lot of fun. Probably helps too that we're right with Pivo Brewery, so they're already having fun. So after there's enough paint on there, then we tilt it. And so that gets the excess paint off and changes the whole look of it. This particular style of paint pour that I'm doing doesn't include silicone. Silicone is another product you can use in paint pouring, and it produces more cells. So see that this is forming sort of like you would expect to see in an agate, where it's stripy kind of. And then if you would use silicone or something that makes cells, it gives it more of a granite look with more of those bubbly kind of textures. And here it's not covering quite enough, so I can cheat and just dab it with my finger, because we want the whole surface covered, including each side. And you can use a torch to pop the bubbles, and that makes more cells. You can see there it kind of pops some of the bubbles in between and sort of blurs the line between each paint. Once these are all dry, then I will coat them with epoxy. And the epoxy that I choose is designed for countertops, so it's rated to 450 degrees. And that's important because you're probably going to be putting coffee mugs and things on it, and if you would use any other kind of art epoxy, it might yellow. For one, you have to be careful that your epoxy isn't going to yellow your product. And then the other thing is, since it's rated to a high temperature, your coffee mug won't stick. Okay. So, since I put pretty much the same paint and the same general pattern on there, you can see how each one is completely different. And that's where I think so many people find this really relaxing. I think it's a good form of art therapy in a way. You can just let it do what it's going to do and be a little bit surprised at the results. That's always fun too. We really love living in Northeast Iowa. We're big fans of Northeast Iowa, so I know a lot of people who would visit the studio tour would come from other places around, and so it was always such a joy to get to meet those people and also our locals too. We lived around the country and in a couple different overseas locations too during my husband's Air Force career, and so we're very happy to be back after 20 years away. So I'm really happy with some of the dribbles that came off of the project we just did. And I'm really hoping they dry well so that I can cut them out and make them into earrings. Here's an example that I was wearing today. So once the paint is dry, then I use a punch to cut that out, that circle. Then I put it in that bezel and coat that with epoxy. And I use a different epoxy for this because I want one that really doesn't yellow at all. And I don't need to have it be safe to 450 degrees. I probably won't be doing anything 450 degrees near my face. When I do paint pours on LP records, I like to make them into clocks. Kind of gives it a functional use as well as a decorative one. Here's an example of the finished coasters. So these are with the paint pour like we did upstairs, and they have the epoxy on them and the cork on the back. And here's a pair of earrings that were made at the same time out of the drips that came off of those coasters. So another type of art that I do is egg art, and so it's eggs decorated with dye and using beeswax as resist. So it's similar to batik, and it's an ancient art. Predates Christianity by quite a bit. They used to have them as sort of talismanic objects, so they were meant for good luck. And the symbols written on them were beautiful, that's true, but they weren't necessarily meant just as beautiful objects. They were meant as good luck charms. And so this is called I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's a Ukrainian word, and I have no Ukrainian background at all. So I think it's called a kitska, or kitski is more than one. And there's beeswax in this little funnel, and there's different sizes of the tips of the funnel. And so the way I do it is I have these electric ones, and so they're plugged in and they're warm. They're about 200 degrees. And then I have beeswax with a little bit of black candle dye in here. And I just drip that in there, and then it's ready to go. And when I touch the tip of the funnel to the shell, then the wax comes out, and there's the different line weights based on how big the funnel is. Well, that one doesn't want to come out right now. And the old-fashioned way to do it was a funnel that you would put next to a candle flame, and you would have cold beeswax that you would kind of scrape into this top, and then you'd melt it with a candle. It's kind of challenging to get guidelines on an irregularly shaped organic object, and one of the tricks that I like to use is called quilling paper. It's just a strip of paper that is consistent in width. And so I'll start at one end and go around, and I mark right there. So that's my longitude, I guess you'd call it. So there's that line right there. So now that I have my length of the egg all the way around, I'm going to fold that in half, make a crease, and then I'm going to make a mark there. So that's my North Pole and my South Pole. And then I'll fold that in half again, and that'll be my equator line. And then once I have the equator line, I can do the same thing with another piece of paper, fold that in half, and then that'll be the halfway point, etc. You'll see when I show you on the egg. So we're going to go here, and I've decided this hole is not quite exactly centered, so I'm going to put that as my center point. So now I can mark my equator line and my South Pole. So I just keep doing that until I get all the guidelines. So here I've done it already. I can connect those dots. So that's the idea with marking the eggs. You have some guidelines. I really like to have eggs with symmetry a lot of times. Sometimes I do ones that are more free-form, but speaking of different kinds of eggs, I do different ones. So here's an ostrich egg, that's an example. And see how shiny that shell is? You have to get that shine off if you're gonna get the dyes to adhere. So that's a step. You sand it and soak it in vinegar, and so there's a whole process, and these can be quite expensive, and obviously this is a much larger canvas, so it takes longer. You have to imagine doing tiny little lines all over this whole surface will take a long time. One egg that I did took about a week, an ostrich egg, and that one was pretty detailed, so it could take less time. This one is an emu egg, and that's how this looks naturally. There's nothing done to this yet. It's got a very pebbly surface, and so as you're working with it, you're going to have a really challenge. You're going to want to use thick lines, and you're going to have to account for that pebbly surface. Usually what people would do with these is they'd do the wax and then etch it in vinegar or a different type of acid if you're careful with the other acids that you're using, and etch it down into the lighter colors. So the next layer will be kind of a teal and turquoise, and then all the way down to white if you dare. Because if you go too far, of course, you're through the whole eggshell. And then there's a rhea egg. That would be another one you could work on. Most common one I use is a goose egg. I like that it's a little more sturdy than some of the other smaller eggs. I have a great source for these at a local hatchery, and so it's easy for me to get a hold of hundreds of these at a time and get them cleaned up and have them ready to go. And then there's turkey eggs and chicken eggs, all the way down to little tiny quail eggs. So this is a quail egg, that's also a quail egg. This one I just soaked in vinegar enough to get the spots off. So this is kind of like a cooking show where you put the cake in the oven and you take it out of the other one and it's already done. So this egg already has the wax lines on it. So everything that's under that wax is going to stay the color of the eggshell. The next thing I did with that is I dipped it in the orange dye. So I just keep my dyes in mason jars. I buy most of the dyes from a place online called Ukrainian Gift Shop. They're aniline dyes, and so they attach to proteins. So I'm just going to pretend that I dipped that in the orange dye and took that out, and I take it out just with the same kind of thing you use for an Easter egg dip. So then voila, it's already orange. But if I had really dipped it in there, then I would dry it with a paper towel and then put it on these nails on that drying rack to dry. So it's a very long process because you have to wait in between each step. So voila, it is orange and it is dry. And then after it would be orange, I would use my Kitska to put wax on all the spots that I wanted to stay orange. And then I would dip it into the red dye, same thing, and put marks on everywhere that I wanted to stay red. And then in this case, the last color would be black. And so at that point, I should have a demonstration egg. I already melted the wax off this, but it would be mostly covered with wax. The whole egg would be covered with wax except for what's black here. And then you melt the wax off. I use like a little heat tool, a little embossing gun kind of a thing, and then wipe it off with a paper towel or a tissue. You can, the old-fashioned way to do it would be to hold it next to a candle flame, and then that candle flame would melt the wax and you'd wipe the wax off. Another thing that's really nice about the process is the wax will dissolve the pencil lines, so any pencil lines you had on there will just disappear. So after your egg has been cleaned of wax and rested overnight, just so that it comes to room temperature and everything, then you have to protect it with varnish. I like to dip it in a varnish that's pretty thick and is non-yellowing. Also, it has to be oil-based. I learned that the hard way. If it's water-based, it will run all your dyes. So an oil-based varnish, and then let that dry and you're ready to go. The egg that I demonstrated was really simple and it did not take very long. I do quite a few eggs that are very intricate. Many of them are original designs. I tend to prefer that. I like to put my own mark on things. As you can see here, I've got my logo included in this one. So this one's in progress. It just has the wax that's going to be white underneath. So the next step would be to dye it a color and cover the wax on that color, etc., until it was done. And then also, like this one is super intricate. Hopefully I don't go blind making that one. And I have done egg earrings or jewelry, so I will take the egg and divide it into shapes, and then that would get cut out and epoxied, similar to the way I did with the paint pours. So this is an example of a commissioned egg that I did. It was a very specific request from a client, and so I enjoy doing those. I've done ones that have family tree eggs, and so there would be the different names of each family along the way there with different symbols that they felt reminded them of their grandparents and such. Here are some examples of eggs that are for sale right now. I definitely need to increase my inventory. I'll be busy the next few months. There are lots of ways to contact me and lots of ways to purchase items. So we have a brick and mortar store that is open. If you'd like to come in, you can check our website is pivoblepta.com. So that's PIVOBLEPTA.com. It means beer and chatterbox. Pivo is beer, Blepta is chatterbox. So here at the brewery and art studio, that's what we're called. There's a shop there at the website, so you can click on that and buy things that way. You can call me, you can email me, you can check our Facebook and contact me that way. Lots of different ways. Thank you for joining me on this virtual tour of my studio. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I can see you in person someday.